Thanks for downloading Tech Tent from the BBC World Service. Find out more about us at bbcworldservice.com/techtent. Hello and welcome to Tech Tent, your weekly spotlight on the technology industry. I'm Chris Fox, sitting in for Rory. This week we've devoted the whole show to the raging trade war between China and the United States. New US tariffs are due to come in on Chinese goods this weekend, so we'll explore how the dispute is affecting the tech industry in both countries. We'll be taking a close look at two sectors in which these superpowers want to be the world leader. Here to break it down are our special guests, Emily Taylor, the Chief Executive of Oxford Information Labs.
I'm here to talk about the trade war and its impact on 5G.
That's the next generation of telecoms. And also with us is the author Callum Chase.
I'll be talking about how artificial intelligence is going to be enormously important to all of us and how it is essentially a duopoly between the US and China at the moment.
And we'll also find out whether the flow of people and ideas between Silicon Valley and China might dry up.
Talk to Stanford University professors who say the Chinese students coming to our labs are the best that we can find, and many of them stay here after graduation.
Now, first, let's have a listen to this.
I think they should make a deal, and I think if they don't make a deal, it's going to be very bad for China. And I very much appreciate the fact that they came out last night, very late last night, and they said, they want to make a deal. They want it to be under calm circumstances. It was a little different kind of a statement. I thought it was a beautiful statement.
That was US President Trump at the G7 summit of top industrialized nations earlier this week, hinting at a resolution to the bitter trade dispute with China that has rumbled on for more than a year. The latest round of tariffs in that trade war will come into effect this weekend, and it will mean almost all goods coming into America from China, including technology products, will cost US consumers more. In all, the tariffs will apply to $550 billion worth of goods from China. China has so far retaliated with tariffs on $110 billion worth of US products. But the row between the two superpowers goes beyond tariffs. The US government has restricted American companies from selling products and services to Chinese telecoms giant Huawei, citing national security concerns. Those are accusations that Huawei rejects. Here's the BBC's Dave Lee in San Francisco and Robin Brandt in Shanghai explaining how the standoff is playing out where they are as far as tech is concerned. First, Dave Lee.
It doesn't take a genius to know what the hot topic of discussion was when President Trump had Apple boss Tim Cook over for dinner at the White House earlier this month. The trade war is hurting Apple in many ways. And when Apple gets hurt, the rest of the tech industry can suffer too. Apple relies on China for much of its success. First, it's where the overwhelming majority of its devices are made. When it comes to the ability to put together the new iPhone, no one can match the Chinese for speed and price. Apple has managed to convince Trump up to now to leave off tariffs on areas that would really hurt Apple. But as the row intensifies, Trump seems to be adding more restrictions all the time. Secondly, the trade war is also affecting sales in China. For much of the past 5 years, Apple has seen its presence in the country grow, with revenue in China being comparable to the whole of Europe. No more. Apple is suffering from currency fluctuations, but also a wave of patriotism. Chinese consumers are more interested in buying Chinese devices, such as those made by Huawei. As economists will tell you, there are no winners in a trade war, and that's what's certainly playing out here. US tech companies are losing out, whether due to the risk of manufacturing being disrupted or straight-up bans on doing business with Chinese firms, full stop. But China is hurting too. Those in the electronics business have begun scouting out ways to move manufacturing out of the country, setting off a chain of events that could do irreparable damage to one of China's biggest and most influential specialist industries. A resolution can't come quickly enough.
Here in Shanghai, the signs are that China is digging in for a long fight. Some in state media here talk about a protracted standoff and no progress until after the US presidential election. Remember, China did not start this trade war, and its view is, reflected again in state media, that the real reason behind it is because the US and some other countries are simply trying to keep a rising China down. China's strategic aims, encapsulated best in its Made in China 2025 industrial policy, is to catch up in areas of the economy that it believes are crucial for its future. catch up in the most advanced areas of aviation, catch up in manufacturing its own microprocessors and chips. And in other fields, it wants to establish a dominant position, like electric vehicles and battery technology. Now, achieving that ambition, which some involved here have told me they know will take far longer than by 2025, also means that China just won't have to be reliant on the US in the future. In terms of China's strengths in this standoff, while some believe this country can simply endure a trade war of attrition for longer because of its authoritarian government. On a more practical level, though, you have US firms who've set up production bases here over the past few decades, and they're now part of a sophisticated and deep-rooted supply network that simply can't be replicated elsewhere in the world, even as export tariffs start to hit demand.
Robin Brandt in Shanghai and Dave Lee in San Francisco. Well, what's the likely course of this tech trade war? I asked Dr. Yu Jie, Senior Research Fellow on China at Chatham House.
On both sides, both Xi and Trump decided not to give up an inch regarding possible negotiation. But then on the other hand, we also see the trade war has not really go to the direction as Donald Trump expected. For example, the American companies still remain reluctant to withdraw from China, from the vast domestic market of China.
And who stands to lose the most if this trade war goes sour?
I think we should look in both short term and longer term. So over a short period of time, and obviously is the Chinese economy suffer more, precisely for the reason that Chinese economy is still, even though they try to reduce the volumes of export, but still very much export-oriented economy. But then on the other hand, many of the American companies depended on China regarding supply chains, regarding infrastructure. So over a longer period of time, I think it's both economy would really suffer from it.
Is either side placed to win a trade war? Will anyone come out of this looking good?
No, I don't think so. I think as what we have discussed earlier, in trade war, no one is really a winner. Precisely it's because that sense of interdependence amongst all the global economies. So it's not exactly American losses is China's benefit or vice versa. But instead, what we have so far is we have that sense of push on consumer product prices around the world. So I would say it's really the global consumers suffer from this bitter spat between the two titans.
Dr. Yu Jie there. A quick word from our guest before we get into more detail. Emily Taylor, is there a risk that Mr. Trump's policy helps China in the long run?
Yes, because China has got these ambitions not to just be copying other people's stuff, but to be, an innovator and to be self-sufficient. The more it's facing bans and tariffs, the more it will be driven to become self-sufficient and doing really difficult stuff that takes a long time to perfect, like creating chips and that industry. So it could well backfire and it could be doing China's work for it.
And how about you, Callum Chase? Do you see a winner to this trade war?
No. If the trade war goes on, then we are in danger of creating the splinter net, where China achieves a level of self-sufficiency, as Emily says, creating their own chip industry, which currently they don't have in a major fundamental way. And we all lose if there's a splinter net. And if we lose access to Chinese researchers and they lose access to Western researchers, it's not helpful.
Well, let's take a closer look at just two of the sectors that are affected by this row between the US and China. Telecoms is one of them, and machine learning or artificial intelligence is another. Let's take telecoms first. And Emily Taylor, you've co-authored a report released this week on exactly this. So first of all, what's at stake here? Are we talking about the global handset smartphone market? Is it network equipment that powers the cellular networks, or both?
It's the new generation of superfast mobile broadband, 5G, the fifth generation. And it will be the infrastructure that powers the Internet of Things, smart cities, the sort of the new generation of technology that we've all been looking forward to, but relies on an intelligent network. And we're going to have, many, many different types of things attaching to the network. So it could be a real opportunity for countries to drive forward, to create wealth and innovation in their territory. So it's very important. The stakes are very high. But this isn't handsets, it's infrastructure. You build it once, it costs a lot. And if you choose a foreign supplier, you have to evaluate the benefits of, what they can do in price and so on with what might be the security risks of having a not so friendly state at the back of your infrastructure provider. What risks are you really running?
Well, here in the UK, a lot of the networks are switching on their 5G services slowly, and many of them are using Huawei equipment. They don't think there's a huge security risk there. Is that the same happening in the US?
Well, in the US, the 4G networks have not used Huawei. The same is the case in Australia. Here, Huawei has been a provider of infrastructure for many years, and the 5G rollouts that we're getting are a mixture between the sort of true 5G that requires a new handset and a sort of faster 4G. Interestingly, the government is still yet to announce its policy on Huawei in 5G infrastructure, and it shows that the market is just driving ahead because that is the time that we are at the moment. This is happening and governments have got to catch up.
And if this is a matter of national security, as has been touted with Huawei's equipment, these allegations that they might have close links to the Chinese government, why does that factor into a trade war? Surely that should be a separate concern. If it's about security, that's very different to getting the best deal on equipment and cheap manufacturing.
Yes, and it shows how intertwined the whole thing is. And by calling national security and saying it's an emergency, as the US have done, they're doing two things. They're raising the stakes really highly, but they're saying, oh, we've got information, but because of national security reasons, we can't share it. And this calls into question for me why close allies like the United Kingdom, who are part of an intelligence sharing partnership, are taking such a different approach, and why, if it's an emergency, truly, was the US prepared to lift the ban for 180 days? It just doesn't make sense to me.
Why is being a leader in 5G so important to both countries?
I think it's partly what's going to ride on top of it, and it's partly because it's infrastructure, you build it once. It's a very valuable part of the new type of technologies that we'll all be using. And if you're down at the infrastructure layer, particularly, we're going to have a different type of network that's much more software driven, much more cloud-based and intelligent. And therefore, the opportunities for bad actors who are part of the supply chain, if they're down at that low level of the network, they could cause a lot of trouble. But there are a whole host of things that are coming together at this time.
And is your view then that President Trump's policies are distracting us from some of the more crucial issues about 5G?
Very much so, because there's absolutely no doubt that the attack surface with 5G is going to increase. There's going to be 20 times the number of devices attached. And it's well known, anyone who likes Internet of Things dialogue knows that, security of Internet of Things devices is pretty poor. So there's lots of opportunities, but also we're not hearing about these secret information that the US may or may not have about Huawei and its link to the Chinese government. But what we do know from independent reports is that the quality of its software and products is shoddy. And if you have shoddy software, you create bugs and opportunities for others to exploit your stuff, no matter where they come from.
It's worth a reminder that Huawei's always denied being linked to the Chinese government. This is Tech Tent on the BBC World Service. I'm Chris Fox, and in a moment, can the past easy interchange of people and ideas between Silicon Valley and China's tech industry be reinstated? Now, another area of tech that is the subject of a great rivalry between the United States and China is machine learning or artificial intelligence. Callum Chase, you're the author of Surviving AI and several other books on this topic. So what are the US and China both doing with AI?
They are leading. In the US, the AI industry is largely the preserve of the private sector, and their tech giants, collectively known as G Mafia, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Intel, and Apple, employ many of the world's leading researchers and developers, and they have enormous compute power, massive amounts of data. They're absolutely at the cutting edge of AI development, and they bring us minor miracles like search and maps and face recognition, chat and translate facilities. In China's different in that the government is all in on AI as well. They also have tech giants, BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, collectively known as BAT, and also Huawei, which prompted all this discussion, which itself invests around $1.5 billion a year in R&D and AI. But the government is heavily investing as well, which is not true in the US. Sadly, the rest of the world is a very long way behind. Probably the UK and Canada are third and fourth, but they are minnows compared to the massive amount of work going on in the States and China.
And you see there's two different approaches there in China and the US. Which do you think is ahead?
Oh, I think it's undoubtedly true that the US is still ahead, and it is not about to be overtaken. The lead and the momentum that the tech giants have in the US is enormous. But China has caught up in the sense that it's made itself part of this duopoly. And, there's a great deal of rivalry. But I don't see China overtaking the US anytime soon. But they will be the two major competitors until Europe gets its act together.
And how important is machine learning and AI going to be in the future, and how essential is it then to be the leader?
I'm not sure it's actually very important to be the leader, but I do think it's important to be on the playing field and in the game. Machine learning is actually a long-established branch of statistics, but it was first successfully applied to AI in 2012, and there was a big bang in AI back then. And prior to that, AI was interesting, did a lot of interesting things, but didn't make a lot of money. Since then, it has enabled Google and Facebook to take over the ad industry's revenues, and which makes Rupert Murdoch and other people very unhappy, and that accounts for a lot of the backlash against the tech giants. And AI is going to get increasingly important. It's going to transform everything about our lives. In fact, the idea that we're heading into the fourth industrial revolution is a massive understatement.
And so if this trade tension between the US and China gets worse, what effect might that have on the respective industries developing AI?
Well, as I said before, you could end up with this fracturing of the internet. Obviously, there's already the Great Wall in China, but you could end up having two rival versions of the internet, which would be damaging for everybody.
Well, talking about collaboration, until recently there's been a rich exchange of people, ideas and technology between Silicon Valley and China's tech industry. But the growing rivalry between the two governments has threatened some of that. Is it inevitable that sharing of expertise will dry up? Well, our Rory Kethlen-Jones spoke to Matt Sheehan, author of The Trans-Pacific Experiment.
Over the past decade, I'd say the flow of people, of money, and of ideas between the two ecosystems kept ramping up and really reached an all-time high around 2017, 2018. You had Chinese engineers coming and populating the big Silicon Valley companies. You had some top Silicon Valley executives going over to China to head up Chinese companies. The flows of money were very rich as well. You had a lot of Chinese venture capitalists showing up in Silicon Valley looking for unicorn startups, and likewise big Silicon Valley venture capital firms showing up in China. And you also had two-way flows of ideas. For a long time, China had looked to Silicon Valley for inspiration and in many ways copying models of early e-commerce or of early portal websites. But around 2014-15 was the first time you started to see Silicon Valley firms looking to China for inspiration, whether that was in mobile payments or it was in the super app WeChat. Suddenly, places like Facebook and Google were realizing that there was actually something to learn from the Chinese side. And so while these flows of people, money, and ideas were reaching an all-time high, you still had a major separation at the level of markets and actual companies entering those markets. So most U.S. companies were blocked in China, and most Chinese companies were unable to enter the U.S. market or couldn't get any traction. The big change in the last few years has been this increasing feeling in the United States, but particularly in Washington, D.C., that China was taking advantage of the U.S., sort of accessing its ecosystem and either stealing IP or just benefiting from sort of the overflow of talent as Chinese engineers started to go back to China in greater numbers.
So what has been the impact of the trade war getting hotter and hotter? Have we seen a marked slowdown in kind of interchange between the two countries?
Absolutely. We've had a crackdown on the flow of people back and forth, tightened visa restrictions here in the U.S., greater scrutiny on Chinese students who want to study in advanced science and technology fields. In terms of money, we've basically seen the cutting off of Chinese investment into Silicon Valley in many ways through heightened scrutiny of those deals. And in terms of ideas, we're even starting to see efforts to both block the sharing or the exchange of intellectual property, to make it more difficult for companies to set up collaborative research labs in each other's markets. So really this technology struggle that I think is sort of masked as a trade war has taken a major toll on these flows at all levels.
So what happens next? Are we going to see an end to a lot of these links, far less sort of mingling of efforts to advance technology?
Clearly, the momentum is going in that direction right now, particularly in Washington, D.C. But I'm based out here in California in the Bay Area. I talk to Stanford University professors who say the Chinese students coming to our labs are the best that we can find, and many of them stay here after graduation, to companies here who say, we really want to continue recruiting Chinese talent because it's driving our companies. And so you have this disconnect in many ways between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. But I do believe that there will be a sort of balancing out of these two considerations and hopefully bringing both those national security concerns from D.C. into conversation with the Silicon Valley desire for integration that can lead to better and safer development of the technology.
Matt Sheehan there talking to Rory. So, Callum Chase, how important is collaboration, and could China go it alone in AI development, or does it require collaboration from around the world?
Right now, China does need Western technology. As we said before, it doesn't have its own basic chipset industry, and it will take some time and a phenomenal amount of investment for it to replicate an Intel and NVIDIA ecosystem. But it could do it. And if it is forced to do it, then, we all lose. And there is this fear of the Thucydides trap, which is the echo of the 5th century struggle between Sparta and Athens. The rising power frightens the existing power, and you end up with confrontation and war. It's not necessary, and we really shouldn't let it happen. It's a political decision.
And Emily Taylor, I wanted to ask you, this week we've seen Google say Huawei's next smartphone won't have access to its apps. Are we going to see more things like that? And what does it mean for consumers going forward?
Well, when we look at the handset market, interestingly, Huawei's sales figures in Europe in the last quarter of handsets have really dived. And that's probably because of all this controversy. European users want to access popular apps. And again, it's going to be driving Huawei. It's announced its own operating system. It's announced partnerships with a Russian operating system. And it's, as Callum says, this splinter net that we could be risking.
Well, let's see how it develops in the next few weeks. It's time to pack up the tech tent for this week. Thank you to special guests Callum Chase and Emily Taylor. You can read more of our technology stories on our website, bbc.com/technology, and join us again in the tech tent next week.